moving towards incorporating into one master narrative all these polytropic inspirations from the recent discussion. So, um, what I was going to say at the end of sort of part one is, even in that first 49 minutes, we already had sort of the seeds of the collapse and the breakdown of the discussion, and that Dugin was talking about Professor Hermann, the assistant of Heidegger at the end of his life, sort of a secretary in a way. But I mean, I listened to the discussion. The discussion's in German. My German's poor, so I couldn't really say based on the discussion. But I just, in general, I'll say what I think about this so-called testimony of Hermann. But what Dugin is saying is that Dasein is not to be considered as he doesn't. There's a lot of points he doesn't specify. I'll state it this way, with the caveat that it might not be the way he understands it. Is that the Indians can't say, or the Hindus can't say, we have a Hindu Dasein, and the same. And so his project, where he tries to theorize Dasein of every group as part of his fourth political question. It's called the fourth political theory, of course. But in a way, it's a fourth political question because it's like the Zeitfrage itself. It's an open question, how to go beyond liberalism as the third political theory. But I think that only becomes a question concerning our eudaimonia, in the sense that Socrates is sort of asking, what is this mysterious thing that's engaging his being? And this is already the so-called, what's later theorized as the transcendent, but what probably doesn't need to be only given in terms of a theory, as it were, in terms of something, a theory as an image, not a world image, but just an image in the sense of a world imaginary that sees things in terms of, say, let's say Fukuyama presents totally a world imaginary, I would say, in that sense. Like that there should be a spread of the so-called democracy, which is a kind of liquid democracy in the sense of the, all those books on the liquid modernity and the risk society and all that stuff. Or in the terms of the world system of Wallerstein. So we could look at it that way, and then what we get is the picture of the question of time is being raised in the sense that Dasein, according to what Nick Land is saying, is then to be understood as time. So I think this understanding already indicates a big problem. So one, I don't think that's right. So just because Sein and Zeit mentions time, that's not what the full sense of the Zeitfrage or being question. So the full sense of the Zeitfrage or being question, if we derive its meaning from the word Dasein, we would understand that one part of our being is sort of treating things as obstacles or as places of a goal, or, I mean, allowing that in a certain sense, place and person amount to the same thing, or at least of equal importance. But this notion of the Zeitfrage from Dasein has, one half that we could think of ourselves in the Zuhanden sense of, which Heidegger exemplifies by saying, if your Dasein is a Congo River Dasein, a cannibal or something, and then you find yourself, like that movie, there's a French movie with cavemen showed up in Paris or someplace in the first half of the 20th century, but or maybe it's like in the 80s, I think. But in any case, that you show up in a place where it's totally alien to you in terms of what should be treated as an obstacle and whatnot. And in a certain way, everything will just be like an obstacle because you won't understand it to the extent that it's incomprehensible to you. It would just be an obstacle. To the extent that you sense that your goal is there, it will be a place that you love. So it will be like sort of there could be the sort of false daimonia, in the sense that this could be activated, like in the sense of the Lotus Eaters, for instance. Like Odysseus has to go sort of dragged by the nape of the neck his shipmates who are hanging out with the Lotus Eaters, and then when he's going out, he explains that they meant us no harm, but we can't stay here. So there could be certain things, which then we get into all these problems of how do you identify the difference between illness and non-illness, addiction, or placement into the environment as your natural state, and therefore as the state your elected state. How do you distinguish these problems? And then, there's all kinds of problems around that, of course, right? So, let me just state a few things around. I mean, again, Dasein being the Zuhanden side, and when we're just speaking and acting as though everything has a fixed identity, like it were an image where everything kind of stands still. We kind of can go back and forth between that, and that Dasein signals something like that, and that this is not a state that most beings are in, is the claim. So that then someone like Harman is just totally ignoring the claim of what Dasein is in order to say instead something that has nothing to do with Heidegger, and just weaving a long story on it about object, or about the Cotton not unlocking all the qualities of the fire, or vice versa, or some kind of theory of just no interest in it, just a mental game that seems to be of no particular significance in any way. But in any case, even if it were, it wouldn't say anything about Heidegger's view of things, because it's very off on a naive tangent. So that's the same thing I was going to say about Nick Land. Is he in this adjacent horizontal or horizon, which does not have the historical consciousness? I think that was the big problem. Everything broke down once they started having to talk about these other problems sort of in the middle of the discussion. And I think Nick Land is, I guess the way I would state it simply, sort of dogmatically, just as something you could write down on the board, is Nick Land does not have the historical consciousness. He doesn't get it. So he doesn't get that. He doesn't seem to have the anthropological consciousness, which would amount to the same thing in a way. That, for instance, that the newer people did not have the concept time. So then we could say, de facto time was affecting them, but what does time mean, and what does it mean that they couldn't, that they didn't have the concept sort of pragmatically means they couldn't have a discussion about it. But then you say they were saying things like, 3 sleeps ago something happened down by the watering hole, or something like that. So it was like de facto they had it, but they didn't have it as something they could discuss. So now we could say the same thing about other groups besides from the Athenians with respect to being itself. So that's what I want to say about the question of the how Heidegger makes his thinking particular in that sense. It's because what he's saying is, I'm still with the problem of Parmenides and with the problem of Anaximander, even if this is a radical singular or something even worse than a radical singular, because not understood in contradistinction to the one and the many problem, and the particular and the universal problem, which it doesn't really drive Hegel, actually, which sort of drives the higher dialectic, but doesn't drive the actual way he thinks about history, which is basically as quantity becoming quality, or space becoming time, somehow becoming a constant becoming. So Heidegger does situate himself in this very particular way in the Western tradition, linking sort of eschewing. It's sort of like he's looking through Aristotle to Plato, and then he's saying, here between Aristotle and Plato, we got this development into the notion of physis or nature, and the notion of aside from physis or nature, the idea and the notion of the nous corresponding to that. Even nous had already been, actually that's true, nous had already been in some way developed, but it was there's some questions in between, like between Aristotle, Plato, the various early Greek thinkers, so-called. How much is the level of the ethics hadn't appeared as a formal idea, for instance. Logic sort of, I guess they say Aristotle's the first logic with the analytics, but in a certain way it wasn't named, and it wasn't quite, it wasn't like as obvious that there would be a bunch of different attempts to answer this question. It was something was sort of built up over on top of the Socratic questions and the rest, and then it's almost like retrospectively it got called logic once you realized there could be a dialogue, the logic, and then you could inquire into what logic ought to mean. It was like there was empirically a logic in Aristotle, but only afterwards did it become this object of attack, of deconstruction, prior to the word. So you have very particular, somewhere in between Aristotle and Anaximander, who Heidegger says first raised his eyes. Anaximander is the one that first raised his eyes by the Apeiron, and as recognized by Aristotle. But it's sort of like somewhere in this region, Heidegger is saying there's something still dictating to us, still speaking to us, and we can still somehow have a discussion with it, so, as it were. Well, in fact, the words, we read the words and they're talking to us, as it were. So Heidegger kind of thinks of, us talking to the early Greek thinkers, or them talking to us. It's both language talking. It's both this sort of somehow more or less pleasant language talking within with the sun shining its golden rays down, or smiling down, I suppose. But that being as it may, I think what Dugin's pointing to is then this question of whether Heidegger himself was excluding the possibility that the other Dasein could do this Seinfrage, which he's kind of transformed into the fourth political theory problem. And the question seems to me to hang on, like, so if we say, yes, look at this singular beginning Heidegger's still appealing to, even when he's asking the Seinfrage, and even when he's going against the basic physis versus eidos sort of split. Even when he's saying we're a little bit prior to that, we haven't forced ourselves to see everything this way. So then it's as though, like, we almost have we have a teaching that could be sort of universalized when treated simply as a series of statements, and then you go around trying to convert everybody to this teaching in a way. But that's when it's stated only on that side and leaving out the Zuhanden side, and then not even, and sort of not going even beyond that into the Seinfrage itself. Something's still left out there. But so I think any question like this, and then, I mean, Heidegger himself did, by the way, speak of the Russian Dasein and et cetera, et cetera. And so I suppose he thought, if the people that are themselves part of this tradition stemming, called the West, would think to the end of the Western thought, which is me, Heidegger, then they could think this. But he doesn't necessarily think Japanese could do that. And he's had these discussions with Japanese. So that was something I think he was still contemplating until he died, and never was able to really write about except a little discussion about language. So yeah, we have a difficult problem there, but I think the straightforward way of showing that Nick Land doesn't have, so he doesn't really have the consciousness that's primed to sort of enter into this type of problem. And the simple way to look at that is, this question of the different times then. So it's like, if you're a Hindu and you think in terms of Dhyana time, or in terms of some kind of karmic time, obviously that's not, that may be the most quote unquote common sense. Like, common sense is this particular concept that only is active in, like, very recently. Like, Aristotle talked about something totally different. Like, Aristotle talked about the endoxa, and about the, he used the word common sense in a different way about the sensorium. But he basically, and then the Catholics talked about the general opinion of mankind, which is kind of like not what anyone thinks, but the general prejudices somehow, or so far as they correspond to good judgment, but only need to be changed because maybe, for instance, the general opinion of mankind, or common sense, thinks water always boils at a certain place, or depending on what region you're from, you might insist, oh no, water doesn't boil at a certain place. It starts little bubbles, and then that's the beginning. There's a small boil, but then there's a seething boil later on. You could have that as your common sense. But then in our time, the common sense is that air pressure affects the boiling point. So there actually isn't a boiling point without reference to the relative altitude, which usually corresponds to the air pressure. And then you modify that general opinion of mankind, and maybe you could build a new one. So I think being unaware of this type of thing, not being aware of it, Nick Land just talks about, there's the common sense form of time, and then there's this philosophic form that puts the future first or something, or and then there's the contrast between the efficient cause and final causality or something. That's like all he thinks about. But he doesn't see, so then when Dugin starts talking to him about all the different times, and goes into all these questions about Descartes and all these things, he doesn't have the sensitivity, and maybe just because he's not primed for it, to respond to him on those questions. Let me just end this by saying that then there was another problem, which is that Nick Land has no sort of sense with respect to, he's so British, so analytic, so atheistic, or put a better way, so much beyond the pantheismus straight, beyond the moment when it was decided personality, which is to say intelligence and will don't really exist, but instead there's some matter up for experimental study, which shouldn't be understood that way. It's also called the Spinoza Isthmus Strait. But that changed the whole grammar, and it's like he's inherited this full on, and therefore he can't see the seriousness in facing up to the biblical questions, for instance, which were sort of raised in the. But I think it's almost like the way he poses the question is so oblique that you would immediately despair of trying to show him the way. It would have to be a leap, because his mentality, he's not entering into the problem properly. He's sort of just treating it as some kind of external trinket, and that's what I thought Dugan made the nice example with the Wordsworth as accusing Byron of some kind of demonic behavior, and then Byron retorting that if you would see the situation, from my place, then we could discuss it. But otherwise, it's difficult to even enter into that problem. But this being said, I think breadcrumbs could be left that could induce people of that disposition to sort of see the sense of it. So I think and I'll just end with one attempt at a breadcrumb like that, is I think when we interpret the Cain and Abel story properly, what it says is Cain, when asked where his brother is, he doesn't say, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper, in a, as it were, a blasé way, or a darkly sardonic way. But rather he says, I didn't know. Am I? And then it's a question, am I my brother's keeper? But it's a question that he's already sort of answered within himself. That's the first moment of ethical consciousness in the Hebrew way of thinking, and the so-called Yahwehist way of thinking. So then if you would key into seeing the text that way, here's the first time this disengaged the record player of the human language games, these type of things, and they're being recorded in the text. Then I think that gives some avenue of invasion into why they're really serious things to look at, and then you can take it further back to this question of the Garden of Eden. The other thing that they left out is discussion on Locke, really, which is kind of interesting. But maybe we'll get to that on another time.